The work that is often the most difficult is for us to look at who we become when our partners are not giving us what we want. But it's also the greatest place of growth. It's the place where we can really learn about ourselves. And then in the learning about ourselves and the sharing of our work around trying to heal that part of ourselves, we actually add so much stability and so much nourishment and so much relaxation to the relationship. Welcome to the Embodied Relationship Experience podcast. I'm John Wineland. Today, I want to talk about the price we need to pay to be in a relationship of sacred intimacy. And oftentimes, when we think about sacred intimacy, we think about this sort of idealized union of divine masculine and divine feminine. We think about, the practice of sexual polarity. We think about all of the really juicy parts of a sacred intimacy, especially sexual intimacy. And we rarely stop to take a look at what's needed to be able to sustain that. Now, I want to make the distinction between sustaining a sacred intimacy and having moments of sacred intimacy, right? Having moments of sacred intimacy, it's relatively easy. You learn how to drop into the meditative practice of really, seeing somebody deeper than their surface. You get to feel deeper into who they are, into their heart, into their soul. These are all things that you can learn. You can also learn how to animate your masculine and feminine tendencies. I mean, this is stuff that you can learn in a weekend workshop and get much better at it. So, creating these moments, these artful, beautiful, juicy moments of sacred intimacy where we are, in our divine masculine, in our divine feminine, ravishing each other, seeing each other deeply. That is a relatively easy thing to learn how to do. What is more difficult is doing the deep interpersonal and relational work that will allow that intimacy to become something foundationally strong, something that can be nurtured and developed and created over, many years, right? Now, some people that might not be their goal in relationship, but for many it is. And I think one of the questions that I get a lot from people is, how do we sustain this? How do we sustain this experience that we've had in this workshop and be able to, take this home for long periods of time and literally, live this way? And the answer to that is usually disappointing to most people because what I say and what I've learned in my own experience, what I'm still learning in my own experience, is that, deep sacred intimacy requires us to do our own deep work. And it requires us to do what David Deida talked about as second stage work, right? So if we think about in David's model of first, second, and third stage relating, in the first stage, we're really just in that kind of normally in that wounded space where I want what I want and I want you to give it to me. It's the space, the first stage tends to be the space of me, right? Of me, of my needs, of my wants. And, we all, spend a lot of time there. There's nothing shameful about that, but it rarely cultivates the kind of depth and it rarely gets us the relational experience that we want. In the second stage of relational intimacy, the way he describes it, it's really about we. It's about us. It's about, what you need and what I need. It's about healing, right? And it's really that aspect of healing that I want to dive into today, because one of the things that allows us to step into consistent third stage practice is that we've really developed a capacity. We've already sort of mastered the us part. And that is where the shit usually hits the fan with most people. That is where I see so many people who genuinely love each other, who might even be having, fantastic sex, continue to struggle with the us part. Terry Real talks a lot about this in his books. He's got a great book called Us, and he talks about the you and me version of relationship versus the us version of relationship. And my point today is I really want to get into this idea that if we want to live in sacred union, if we want to really exist in this capacity, this artful capacity of spiritual intimacy, we have to master us. The reason is because when we start to do the very deep work of sexual polarity, we start to do this, we start to have these incredibly open, beautifully expansive, yummy and juicy sexual experiences. We really open, we learn to open during sex, to open as love, to open as consciousness. When we do that, we bring other stuff with it. It's very rare that and this is what I see in a lot of workshops, right? It's often that when people start to tap that capacity to really bring more of themselves and open their hearts and open their bodies and be with each other in such a deep way, it often will kick up all of the grief and all of the trauma and all of the things that they've been carrying their entire lives around relationship, especially. So it becomes tantamount, that we work on these, because if we don't take advantage of our newfound openness to really deal with the things that have been lurking in our bodies and in our minds and in our psyches, since we were children, then those things, let's call, those wounded parts, those demonic or gremlin parts of ourselves will derail our intimacy. It'll derail our capacity to stay in a space where we feel like us is incredibly solid, where we feel like us is safe, where we feel like us is trustable. And if we can't live in that space of trustability, where we really know that our partners are allies and that the relational experience we're having is an us experience rather than a you and me experience, it will usurp whatever sort of tantric capacities or sexual polarity capacities or any other kind of, sort of yogic sexuality that we've practiced and gotten good at. The key to sustaining this spiritual intimacy, the price we have to pay, so to speak, is that we've got to go back into our space of healing. We've got to address, the places in us that were wounded. We've got to address the pathologies that we're bringing to the relationship. I'll get more into this, but I just as a concept want to, lay this out that, the capacity to have deep sex, the capacity to create a deep intimacy, those are easy skill sets to learn. The difficult skill sets to learn are how to stay non-reactive in the face of your partner's criticism, for example, or withdrawal, for example. I know in my own life, that's been something that I've had to work with, even though, I've had 15 years of practice in this. Those are the areas that still come up, right? What happens to me when my partner withdraws? What happens to me when my partner is critical? And those areas of reactivity will undermine our capacity to be close and intimate sexually. So the whole, last episode I talked about the three pillars of sacred intimacy being one pillar, our sameness, our human bond, our shared recognition of each other's souls. That's one pillar. The second pillar is this devotion to your partner's nervous system, which is a lot about what I'm going to talk about today. And then this third pillar, which is sexual polarity. So if we're in this practice of creating devotion for our partner's nervous system, we're literally in the practice of solidifying us. We're solidifying the temple of our love. And how do we do that? I want to give a few really concrete ways that we can start to work on that and talk about how that will impact our sexual capacity. I think that what most people realize, most people, I guess they intuit, I don't think they consciously realize this, but what I've seen over the many years of teaching men and women and what I've seen in my own relationships is that sexual intimacy is the byproduct, the depth of sexual intimacy is the byproduct directly related to the emotional intimacy that we experience. So, we can perform we can perform, and I see people do this all the time. We can perform, as the divine masculine, the mountain of consciousness, or we could perform as the goddess, or as the seductress, or any number of masculine and feminine energetic textures and archetypes. But unless we're really nourishing, the soil of our relationship with the nutrients needed, right? It's like we're missing the soul of our sex. Our sex can be very beautiful and very deep, oftentimes very satisfying, but there's this soul nourishment that gets missing. And so when we tend to that, when we fertilize that, it adds a richness and a depth, which shows up in our capacity to really open and be with our partners. So if we think about, let me just step back and go over again these 3 stages of relationship as David Data laid them out. The first is about me and my needs, right? And oftentimes that comes out as, kind of complaints or criticism about what we are or are not getting from our partners. The second stage is really about we, where there's this sort of negotiation of like, here's what I need. What do you need? Here's how I'm feeling. How do you feel? It's this sort of capacity to learn to be with this usness without denigrating the relationship back into 2 individuals who are often at odds. So the third stage, as I've spoken about before, is kind of beyond us. It's beyond me. And it's really about it's about the divine. It's about the art of loving. It's about love itself. It's about openness itself. It's about, the spiritual aspects of we are all the same in some aspect or another. So how do we start this? I think the first piece that I'd like to offer today is that diving into owning our own shit starts with being really clear on the pathologies that we're bringing to the relationship. If you think about it this way, imagine you're with a partner who has some pathology or neurosis that you're aware of because you're just seeing it. It's right there in front of you, but they're not. Right? Let's say they have some addictions or they're addicted to technology or to gaming or to anything, right? But they're not aware of it. What that is going to do is it's going to put you on alert, right? Because you're never quite sure whether or not you can trust them to be aware of this kind of blind spot, let's call it. If they're aware of their blind spot and they're working on it, that will relax you, right? Other way around, right? If you become aware of your blind spots and you let your partner know, like, wow, I'm noticing that I'm having this blind spot. I'm reactive in this way, or I'm, angry and pursuing in this way, or I'm avoidant in this way. It helps to really relax your partner. It's a way to tend for your partner's nervous system, right? It's a way to help relax your partner's nervous system. So owning our own pathologies, I believe, is one huge piece of being devotional to your partner's nervous system, that second pillar of relating. And I think relating to David Data's model, I think that falls into what he would call second stage practice and second stage healing. Another way to look at what it means to own our own shit, in our relationship as an offering to sacred intimacy, is to be aware of our shadows, right? To be aware of the, angry child in me, or be aware of the wounded child in me, or be aware of the critic in me, to be aware of these parts of me that are going to come out as we get more intimate and more committed. Usually, the first few months of intimacy are kind of on hopped up hormones and we're all on our best behavior. But once we say move in together, or once we decide to start a family together, once we get married, once we get into these really deep committed experiences, we are magically transported back into the space of our family of origin. And so being able to, come to the relationship with some understanding, even if it's, still vague, is a way to, it's an act of devotion, right? To own our own shit is an act of devotion. And I really want to, nail that home because, when we think about devotion, we often get this image of, being on our knees in devotion to somebody or having a wide open devotional heart. And that's all true. That is an aspect of devotion. But, devotion to the relationship, devotion to our partner's nervous system also requires that we let them know how we tick, that we let them know, how, where our reactivity is coming from. We let them know exactly how our nervous system is going to respond to certain stimulus, certain triggers. If we let them know like, hey, when you withdraw, you can bet that I'm going to be pursuant. If you withdraw, I'm going to pursue. I may transgress, I may even try to transgress your boundaries. This is my habit in intimacy. But I'm working on that. I'm working on being aware of that. I'm in therapy because of that. I'm going to take space rather than knock on your bedroom door and try to get you to talk to me. I'm going to give you space and make a request that you come to me when you're ready, hopefully not too long, right? So just being able to identify and bring our own awareness and our own sort of ruthless honesty to the things that are going on in us is an incredibly helpful way to lay the groundwork for sacred intimacy. And, going back to how sacred intimacy literally pops the top on our wounds and on our fears. This is something that's not normally talked about, in the field of sexual polarity or in sacred intimacy. And so I think it's important to bring it up here. Here's the way I normally see it in workshops. I'll be leading couples through practices of sacred intimacy, and, I'll be addressing the feminine partner, asking her to open her heart and to trust the partner in front of her and to give him or her feedback as she's opening up her heart. And I'm directing the masculine partner, to be fully present, to be fully grounded, to, fill her open heart with your love and consciousness, to, I'm actually guiding them in how do we open together as consciousness and love, right? So what inevitably happens, and it happens to both masculine and feminine practitioners, is that as their hearts begin to open and as they're faced with a really deep connection or really deep intimacy sparked and also amplified by sexual energy, is that past traumas and fears will start to come up, right? Past traumas and fears will start to come up. And of course, when we're working in this kind of third stage space, the yogic answer to that is to just keep opening, open as the fear, open as the grief, open as the yearning, open as the, to continually open as the feeling. But what will often happen is after the exercise is over, they're left with this kind of revealed storehouse of you could call it disappointment, you could call it grief, you could call it fear. There's often lots of things that come through. Oftentimes for the masculine practitioners, it's a fear of I didn't do that right, or I didn't do it good enough, or, there's something, I'm not doing it right. That tends to be the masculine, fear and shame that come through, and for the feminine practitioner, it tends to be this sense of, I don't feel safe, or it's not safe for me to open this much, or I'm too much. That's often a big one, right? Like I'm too much. And so what this is pointing to, it's one of the reasons why I love this work so much, is it literally elucidates through your practice what the deeper personal practice is. It shows, like, if for example, if you're a feminine practitioner and you have this feeling as you open and express and feel so much that you're too much, this fear of like, oh, I'm too much, and there's too much, my anger, my grief, my longing, my, all of it, my fear, it's just too much for somebody to meet or love, right? That is a beautiful opportunity to take that off the mat and to go back, after the workshop's over, to go back into your own, personal exploration, to get clear on where that came from. What can you do about it? Maybe there's inner child work. Oftentimes there's shadow work, which is something I love. I actually love both of those modalities. There's likely a lot of things you can do to address the things that came up as you opened your heart and body so fully. And what I see normally is that most people will acknowledge, like, oh, I had all this fear come out, I had all this longing come out, I had all this grief come out, but rarely do they go home and start to do the deep work on it. They just kind of wait to enter that space again, that really yummy space of sacred intimacy, and be in those feelings of closeness and love and all of those things. What will happen is, if we don't take responsibility for the things that are bubbling up as we deepen our practices. And this can happen in your own solo practices as well. If you're doing a grief practice or a pleasure practice or some kind of anything that opens your heart and gets you in your body, of course, stored trauma that stays in our body, the body keeps the score, is going to come up. And oftentimes this will shut us down. But I want to really highlight here that the practices that we're doing are taking us to the deeper practices of work that we need to attend to. Let me give you some examples of this. I'll give you one from my own relationship. So my partner and I will often have these periods where we're in this, incredible love bubble, and, our sex is yummy and we're so connected and there's so much magic and we're just both like so open in love and so grateful. It's just it's like, Valhalla, the Valhalla of relating. But inevitably, the day or two afterwards, some crunchy things will start to come up, right? Some crunchy, resentments will come up or fears will come up. And what this is pointing to is that the openness that we experience through our practice, revealed some things that needed to be worked on. Areas of codependency or overdependence or withdrawal or, any number of things that, just the byproducts of the way we were raised and the issues of dysfunctional parenting, nothing crazy, and that there's nothing wrong with it. But it's really important to know, and this happens to a lot of couples, is that after these great experiences of openness, it's not unusual for, the crunchy stuff to bubble up to the surface. Another example that I'll see oftentimes is that there will be this, people will be in, an attempt at a very sacred intimacy, a very sacred practice, either, in a workshop or at home. They'll try something, they'll try to stretch, right? They'll try to stretch their capacity. A masculine partner might bring, more of his primal beast. And even though it's a beautiful sexual experience and his partner loves it, afterwards, the shame of that will often bubble up, right? The fear of like, oh no, did I hurt her? Or that part of me is ugly, or that part of me is dangerous, will come up. And so now he's left with a couple of choices, right? I can either fall into shame about it, or I can kind of avoid it and pretend it's not there. I can, just kind of be with it momentarily, but not really address it. Those are all things that I've seen, especially with men. But what he can do is he can say like, wow, like I was loving my partner deeply. I was bringing fierce love and sort of primal desire. And then afterwards, I felt shame. what does that mean? Where does that come from? And if he's, on his game and, hopefully he brings it to some men he can trust, they'll point like, man, that's an area where you have to go back, likely in therapy or, maybe in a group, right? And address the part of you that feels ashamed by your primal desire. It feels ashamed for your kind of, beastie love, that feels ashamed about, being fierce and bringing your killer or your warrior. So to continue to stay in an ongoing opening space of sacred intimacy, he will have to address that. Otherwise, it's just going to keep coming up and she'll feel it, right? She'll feel it in him, and it's going to block their capacity to connect deeply. So as we open together sexually, as we become, more adept at practices, tantric practices and sexual polarity practices of opening our range and opening our capacity, these things are going to come through. These things are going to come through, and each one of them is a beautiful invitation to till the soil and to fertilize the soil. Soil gets fertilized with our shit, right? So to till the soil and fertilize the soil with our past beliefs, with our insecurities, with the roots of our insecurities, which are oftentimes, trauma, family system trauma, and the grief of carrying that trauma. So let's think about this kind of symbiotic relationship between, the practice of sexual polarity and sacred sexual intimacy, and then this deep personal work that we have to do. Oftentimes, to give another example from the feminine side, if, for example, she's afraid to say no to something that she doesn't like, right? And so she'll just she's in this deep experience, and something is going, she's being touched or being maneuvered, or something is happening that doesn't quite feel good to her nervous system. He's not staying present, for example. If she hasn't learned to really own her no, or she has been punished for delivering her no, then that will be a block. It's this literal impediment to them going any deeper. But if she comes out of that, and maybe, she could talk to him about it and say like, wow, I noticed that there's this thing that I didn't really feel good, but I didn't say no. And, you didn't do anything wrong because I didn't let you know, but it just didn't feel good. And I didn't actually own my no in that. Again, that is a beautiful thread that can be pulled on and looked into, again, therapeutically, with her women friends or with a counselor or mentor or something like that. There's all kinds of modalities, these healing modalities. The healing modalities that are available these days, they're just fucking endless and amazing. I am a huge fan of embodied therapy. There's trauma release. There's EMDR, there's imago therapy itself. There's all kinds of, techniques and modalities now to help us move through the trauma that we've stored in our body. And so if we really want to live in this space of sexual intimacy that has literally infinite depth to it, it's not like we're limited by the amount of love and pleasure and consciousness. Well, I guess, you could technically, make the point that we might have some limitations, but there's so much space in our sexual capacity to receive more love and pleasure, to give more love and pleasure. But that is dependent. It is dependent on us being able to clear our bodies of the trauma that we've carried, right? Otherwise, what will happen, and what I see happen all the time, is that there is this pasting over. We'll use our practices to paste over the wounds and the trauma, right? Versus using the wounds and the trauma as nutrients, as fertilizer for an even deeper sexual and spiritual experience. So how can we become more adept at owning our shit, at identifying, the pathologies and the habits and the patterns that we bring into our relationship? I think there's a few ways that I'd like to lay this out. The first and easiest way is to understand your reactivity, right? What happens when you get triggered? Because the thing about our childhood wounds and our patterns is that they happen unconsciously and they happen instantly. So in being aware of how I react to a specific trigger, right? And these triggers tend to be very repetitive. I think we can all agree on that in relationships. It's the same kind of argument again and again. It's the same sort of breakdown again and again. So one of the ways that you can start to identify the parts of you that need to be tended to. I mean, I gave some examples, based on, deep things that may come up during deep sexual practice. But another way to look at this are the things that come up when my partner isn't doing what I want, right? When the world or the guy I dated or, my feminine partner isn't giving me what I want, what do I do? And what that will uncover, is your strategy. Something, somebody like Terry Real would call your adaptive child, right? But we all have these strategies of trying to fix things when our partners are not giving us the kind of love that we want. So I do think that there's a really important practice that I would like all of you to try at home, which is to look to the moments where you get triggered and start to pull on that thread, really get clear. So, he gets dismissive with me, for example, and what happens in your body? What do you notice in your body? What sensations do you notice in your body? Where has this happened previously in your life? And then be really aware of what it is that you do in response to that. When you do that, you start pull the thread on that, you're going to probably come to a wound or a pattern or an experience, an event that led you, or a series of events that led you to develop that strategy. And being able to articulate that to your partner is really important. So for example, if he's dismissive with you and your reaction, your pattern is to get really quiet and just withdraw for a couple of days and sort of, seethe in resentment or silently scorn or, punish with coldness or any of that. If that's your pattern, one of the first things you can do is you can say like, wow, when you just said that, I felt so dismissed and I'm wanting to do this. I'm wanting to withdraw. I'm wanting to be cold. I'm wanting to punish you, right? You can just narrate what your impulse is. You can also say, if you're aware of this, you could say something like, and what I'm aware of is that the part of me that feels unimportant to you, the part of me that feels like you don't care. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that that kind of response will often nurture intimacy, will nurture empathy, will nurture care in a way that your habitual pattern could not. So there's so many moments that we can slow down and put the microscope of our awareness on and track, right? What's our reaction? What are the feelings beneath the reaction? If I really pulled on this thread as far as I could, what would I find? Would I find something in my childhood? Likely, right? Would I find something in my past relationships? Likely. So, we get to, the beautiful thing about sacred intimacy is that it will continually ask us to go deeper and deeper into healing our own wounds, into healing the wounds of our parents and the generations before our parents, because as we know, trauma gets passed down. It will keep us focusing on the things that we need to, I don't want to say fix, but the things we need to integrate, the things we need to, heal so that we don't pass them on to our children, right? We are making a stance to change a relational karma. That's the way that I would like to describe it. And what that requires is that we look deep in those moments when we get triggered. And if we can create a culture in our relationship where that kind of exploration and that kind of personal ownership and that kind of unwavering responsibility for what we are bringing to the relationship, it will create the foundation of safety. It will relax our partner's nervous system. It will also relax our own, because when we own a truth and we can own it, with our head held high and our heart somewhat open, right? We're not collapsed into this truth, but when we can own a truth lovingly, we also feel better about ourselves. So all of these building blocks are required for us to have the foundation, a strong foundation for our temple. And I really do believe that in order to create the sustainable, sacred intimacy that we crave, the intimacy that allows us to swim in the divine, to really live in magic, to make our sex artful and magical and deep, does require us to create this foundation. And it's lazy. And again, no judgment. I've certainly done it. It's lazy for us to expect that we can just kind of have a strategy of becoming, deep sexual intimacy practitioners, but not address the deep wounds and deep patterns that have been passed down from generation to generation, and that we've kind of cultivated and solidified throughout our lives. So I'd like to leave you today with reflection. And I'd love, if you feel like it, to take a moment with a notebook and really take an inventory of the patterns that you're aware of, the patterns in your relationship that get, kicked off when a very, consistent trigger is fired, and start to take stock of what your reactivity is and what your pattern is in these moments of conflict, or in these moments of perceived conflict, or in these moments of not getting what you want, right? The deepest work I think that we can do, right? The work that is often the most difficult, is for us to look at who we become when our partners are not giving us what we want. But it's also the greatest place of growth. It's the place where we can really learn about ourselves. And then in the learning about ourselves and the sharing of our, work around trying to heal that part of ourselves, we actually add so much stability and so much nourishment and so much relaxation to the relationship. So take an inventory of where you get reactive, what happens in your body, where that has been a pattern before in your relationships, where you think it comes from. By all means, feel free to talk to a therapist or another professional who can help you unpack these things. And rather than thinking about it as something that is wrong with you, or something that needs to be fixed, or something that is shameful, right? Think about it as the price you're paying to have the deepest intimacy possible. Think about it as the price of entry to creating a sustained temple of love. I think if we do that, then the foundations of our temples will be strong. If we don't do that, then again, like I shared about in the last episode, we've got one pillar that is kind of cracked and weak, even though the other two pillars might be somewhat strong. And so, unfortunately, and again, this is the big message I think that will come through in this podcast. We have to do our own work in order to have the kind of intimacy that we crave. A final thought on this is that we get to create the culture of relationship that we want to live in. Right? We can take responsibility for the culture that we create. We could have a culture of complaint. We could have a culture of exploration. We could have a culture of adventure. We could combine, a few different types of values to create our culture. But what I'm offering here is that you consider creating a culture of self-reflective honesty, and that you create a culture of self-responsibility in order to sustain the relationship, rather than looking for our partners to change. Right? Let's turn the lens on ourselves and really look at what we are bringing to the dance. I think that is the most emotionally mature and also the most useful. I mean, let's face it, complaining about not getting enough from your partner never gets you more. I don't know, maybe you guys have the experience, but it's actually much more effective for us to really look at ourselves and to model what taking responsibility for our own reactions and our own patterns and tendencies are. So, for example, if you know that you're avoidant in your relationship, letting your partner know, right? That, this is the reason why I'm avoidant, and this is when I get avoidant, and this is, what it feels like for me, and this is what you might be able to do to help me. You can create a culture where that kind of honesty and that kind of self-reflection is natural, and it's just part of your intimacy. It's part of what you create. One of the things that my teacher used to say, and I think it really is true, is that sacred intimacy, or the deepest practice, what he would call third stage practice, starts when we don't need our partners to be any different. Starts when we don't need the moment to change, or we don't need them to be any different. How do we get to that place? We examine and unearth and heal the parts of us that we think need to be different. We cannot see another as perfect, imperfect human, child of God, so to speak, while we are still feeling the parts of us and ignoring the parts of us and, living in the parts of us that are not feeling whole and complete. This is why I think that doing our own personal work, really working on the divine union within, right? And what the divine union means to me is that we are integrating, all of the wanted and unwanted bits of ourselves in a way that is healthy, healing, loving, and whole. As we do that, we get much better at accepting and loving our partners as they are.